Story 1. I never experienced a holiday with family that didn't devolve into fighting and hurt feelings until the first Thanksgiving I spent with my husband's family. I was on edge the whole day, just waiting for someone to say or do something that triggered a fight. That never happened, and it was a wonderful, pleasant holiday. I just assumed explosive fights were inevitable at any family gathering until that day. Story 2. I grew up assuming all dads beat up their wives and kids. I disliked every dad of all my friends just in principle and assumed they were going through the same ordeal I was. Even when the dads were nice to me, I thought, yeah, right, the second I leave the real you will come out. Because that's what my dad was like. It wasn't until I was 8 years old that I realized it's just my dad. Most other dads were pretty decent. It was both a reassuring and depressing realization. Story 3. Practicing a conversation in your head before having it. Not even difficult talks, just casual conversations you might have with someone. Also, imagining someone asking you a question and answering the question in great detail in your head. Story 4. Suicidal thoughts. I thought that you should talk to a doctor about it. Meant if I thought about it more than normal. I had to be told that thinking about it at all was not normal. Story 5. Having a rough relationship with your parents. I'm an adult now, and it still shocks me when I find out that there are actually people who enjoy being around their family. Story 6. Thinking constantly. As in there's not 1 second where I'm not thinking about something. Apparently, there are people who actually aren't thinking about anything at all, most people in fact. When I ask my husband what he's thinking about and he says nothing, he means it literally. I just thought it was a thing people said. I didn't know it was actually true. Story 7. The way my family can have, for different conversations going on at the same time with everyone participating in all of them. Turns out roughly half of us have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Story 8. All of the abuse I dealt with as a kid. When I was 16 years old, my mother took me to look at swimsuits. I was still gaining weight at that time. I picked out a swimsuit that I liked, and she told me, "You can't wear that because you have too much skin." When I argued that I had just as much skin as all the other girls, she said, "You can't wear what the pretty girls wear." And this devastated me. When I turned to put this one suit back on the rack, another woman was staring at my mother with her mouth agape. She looked extremely offended and like she wanted to say something to me. She simply glared at my mother and walked away. It was in that moment that I realized what my mom said to me was not a normal thing that mothers say to daughters. That moment changed the entire trajectory of my childhood and changed how I see myself. Until I understood that my mother was abusing me with her words, I thought that there was something wrong with me. Story 9. Growing up, my family never had music playing in the house. I would listen to a CD on the walk to the bus stop and while on the bus, but other than that, it was the radio for background noise in the car or nothing. Now it feels like everyone is always wearing earbuds or headphones or has some speaker in their house that they use to listen to music, and I don't really do that. I listen to the radio while I'm driving, and if I have a craving for a specific song, I'll find it on YouTube and listen to it, but other than that, my life is pretty musicless. Story 10. I thought it was normal to have thoughts that never stop, almost to an obsessive level. When something bad crosses my mind, intrusive thoughts, it takes 10 to 20 minutes for me to stop obsessing over it and trying to figure out what's wrong with me. I thought everyone dealt with it, and I was just being sensitive for not being able to handle it, but my friends say they don't experience that. They get intrusive thoughts, as most people do, but it doesn't take as long for them to get over it. I've realized that these thoughts are why I lose myself in music or video games so frequently and why I had so much trouble in school growing up. And now, why it's so hard to be normal at work. I use these outside distractions to keep me from thinking too hard, and when I'm without them, it drives me crazy. The downside to being so absorbed in games and music is that it leaves little room for me to comprehend anything happening around me. My partner will talk to me and have to repeat himself several times before I understand what he's saying. My friends consider me always distracted because of this, despite never using any sort of drugs. In summary, I probably have obsessive-compulsive disorder and had no clue how bad it was until a few months ago. Story 11. Not being allowed to associate with people outside of my religion, being homeschooled to not associate with the world, being told my only goal in life should be to get married as soon as I turn 18 to a man who has a job that just barely covers the bills, so we can both spend as much time preaching in the ministry as humanly possible. Story 12. Asking for permission to speak. I was about 28 or 29 years old when I got out of the habit. I was so used to using, "Can I say something?" as a way of gauging family members' emotional states that I did it at work. One boss finally flat out told me I was the subject matter expert on that file. I had to stop asking permission to do my job and tell people what needed to be said. Story 13. Synesthesia. My college lecturer was making a big deal about a composer who saw colors when he heard music, Scriabin in this case, and I was like, wait, there are people who don't? Story 14. Having an inner dialogue not made of words or inner speech. For me, it has always been 95% images or scenes. Words are just for communicating with others. I legitimately thought all those scenes in movies and television shows where a character talks to themselves in their head were a literary device to convey the character's emotions. I never in a million years ever thought some people actually think in words. I found out this was the case when I was well over 40. Story 15. A lot of abusive behaviors. Sadly, because those behaviors were normalized by people who were meant to love me, I saw no problem getting into relationships with men who were equally abusive. Story 16. I thought it was normal that your partner has sex with you whenever he pleases despite saying no multiple times. Took me 2 years after that relationship to realize that I had been raped constantly. It explained a lot of my behavior that I wasn't aware of or couldn't understand myself. Rape doesn't have to include violence. No means no, everything else is rape. Story 17. I come from a traditional Mexican household and was extremely surprised that other households weren't raised like mine. In my family, the firstborn female child needs to stay at home until she is married to take care of her parents. She might have a part-time job but is not expected to move away for college to get an education. Story 18. Maladaptive daydreaming. I thought everyone goes to a different universe when they are sitting quietly. Turns out only some people do it. Do you know how many books I could have written if I didn't have to study and work to survive? Some of those universes are so good I used to make up stories to tell other people like, hey, there's this book I read, it goes like this. Oh, you like it? Of course, I could give you the link, but it's in a language I speak that you do not. Story 19. Until I turned 17 and moved in with my aunt, I thought everyone did some form of an illegal drug. I grew up around drugs my whole life and honestly thought it was normal. When I asked my aunt what drugs she does, I thought she was going to lose her mind. Story 20. Internal monologue, thinking in pictures and able to visualize in 3D. I thought everyone did it until I tried explaining my thought process to a few of my friends, and they just gave me weird stares as if I'm schizophrenic. Story 21. Being made to eat food I didn't like and having to completely finish my plate. I cry as my dad screamed and fed me my food. I gained weight and then developed an eating disorder years later. Thanks, Dad. Story 22. One of my friends can smell ants. She thought everybody could. She can smell them from pretty far away, and it gets worse when you step on them. She was always insistent on not stepping on them. I thought she was joking, but it's actually a thing called formic sensitivity. Story 23. When I talk to other people about my time on a ship, especially to those who have also been on a ship, their reaction is often, "What was wrong with your ship, leadership, etc.?" It helped me realize that I wasn't actually crazy and that it really was a very toxic place. Story 24. I just found out that other people aren't constantly swallowing their liquids back down after eating or drinking and can bend over without the contents of their stomach coming back up. I thought that's what we were all doing every day. So anyway, I have gastroesophageal reflux disease. Story 25. Having to prove anything I say. I grew up in a family where everything I stated, or even a random sentence I said, had to be scanned thoroughly to see if I was lying or not. One day, I was talking with a guy who was my talking stage at the time, and anytime I said a sentence, I'd be like, wait, let me search for the proof or screenshot. He noticed I did it a lot, and then he said this with the most comforting and relieving tone ever. Don't you worry. I believe you. I trust you. You all cannot imagine how this simple sentence has changed my whole perspective because before then I never noticed this pattern. And the guy forever has my heart because of this, even though he and I don't talk like we used to before. Story 26. I eventually realized this after being slapped or hit by my parents. Dad threatened to hit us with this gray foam stick if we didn't hurry to brush our teeth and get ready for bed. We had foam square mats, and the gray piece went outside of them. It seemed like verbal abuse. Even now, I can't tell if it was truly verbal abuse or just angry yelling and screaming. I never told my mom anything growing up about things like school or how presentations in front of the class made me so anxious and scared that I'd sweat and my stomach would hurt. Story 27. Eating dinner at the table as a family. It wasn't until I got to high school where I realized I was the only one of my friends who did this every single night. Story 28. When I got in trouble as a child between ages 5 and 11 or wanted attention, I wasn't allowed to eat and had to stay in the room alone for the rest of the day or night, sometimes the weekend, depending on whether I had school the next day. School was a savior, secretly. I brought it up to my mom, how it bothered me still to this day, and her response was, "Well, you shouldn't have wanted attention." Okay, love. Story 29. There was a lot of neglect in my household growing up. The early years, but still. Neglect isn't always financial. Comes in many forms. I read about someone else's experience with it, and it hit me. Story 30. Eating lemons. A fresh, chilled, and sliced lemon with salt sprinkled on it is the best thing in existence. Several people throughout the years have found it extremely weird and shared their thoughts about how unusual it is. It will not stop me, though. Story 31. Being able to smell a sneeze. When I step into a room where someone sneezed minutes before I entered, I can smell it. I told my sister about it, and she said that it isn't possible and that I'm just overreacting. But no, I can actually smell it. Do others have this too? Story 32. I thought everyone's fingers bent 90 degrees backward until I was 16 and a new acquaintance was shocked to see that. I learned I have joint hypermobility in my fingers. Story 33. Not burping. I always assumed burping was a rare occurrence for everyone, but I found out about 1.5 years ago that it's actually a syndrome. Most people burp numerous times a week and whenever necessary. Story 34. I grew up with an Asian mom in the United States who wore surgical masks a lot. She would go to Walgreens and buy these child-sized masks and put them on my face because whenever she was wearing one, I had to wear one too. Part of it, I think, was out of very specific compulsion at the time, talking about the 2000s, and part of it, I think, was remnants of SARS and that I was sick a lot growing up. I didn't get diagnosed until my early 20s, but I always had certain symptoms. I have a kidney defect and autoimmune disorder, so maybe wearing masks was good for me. So I grew up thinking a lot of my friends and their moms did that. I wore them to school every day, but when I went to friends' houses, their mom wasn't wearing a mask, and they weren't wearing a mask. So I asked why because I was pretty confused. Story 35. I have visual snow and it causes some vision irregularities for me, the most obvious one being a layer of what looks like static from a TV but just everywhere, always. It was only maybe 2 years ago, at 25 or so, that I was talking to a friend and mentioned the static to him and he was confused. He teases me all the time, so I figured he was joking around, but it got in my head a little. So I asked some others what they thought of the static, and no one knew what I was going on about. Totally messed up my world, to be honest. I lived my whole life up until then believing that everyone saw the static everywhere and it was just a normal thing. I'd even spent time debating with myself what it could be. Am I seeing air? Seeing space? Is it just a texture you can see? Nope, turns out it's just a condition. The static part is not invasive for me at all because I can ignore the static easily, but it really shook my world up learning that that's not something everyone sees. Probably the most insane I've ever looked when I learned that and was all frantic and panicked. Like, do you see the static? What do you mean it's not there? It's everywhere. How do you not see it? Story 36. Yelling and cursing loudly when angry, even in public. My family, especially my sister, is like that. She was my role model for about 25 years, and when she acts out like that, she always tries to make it right by pointing out how messed up the situation or people that made her react like that were. So I always kind of admired her honesty. Don't get me wrong, I do believe that it is often good to speak up and sometimes very understandable if a person screams, but pick your battles. She has the same exact reactions now when she is seriously ill as she had in her 20s when someone would cut in the waiting line. Story 37. Every room in the house is clean. My mom is a very passionate neat freak. Think Monk or Monica from Friends level. I had no idea that hoarding was not only a thing, but it was a certified mental disorder until I saw the show Hoarders. Story 38. I thought everyone had multiple kinds of fruit and berries at home. I thought it was weird when we had to go to the grocery store for other food and saw all that stuff there, and my friend's parents buying it. Then, as I got older, I realized I was just lucky to have a variety orchard.